We'll see today critical reasoning. Critical reasoning is very important type of questions, particularly for GMAT, where you have 12 questions on critical reasoning pattern. Critical reasoning involves analysis of an argument, deciding if there is any assumption made in the argument, or identifying an option that strengthens or weakens the argument. We'll see in this session the definition of argument, types of arguments, general approach to critical reasoning questions, specifically identifying assumptions in the argument, identifying inferences, and of course, trivia. Friends, what is an argument? Well, argument is not a counter statement. It is rather a series of statements which are meant to establish a particular claim. That is to say, there has to be a claim and there has to be statements which establish the claim, right? Thus, if we see, the argument has two essential parts: a claim and the statements which establish this claim. The claim that is to be established or that is established, we'll call it a conclusion. And the basis on which this conclusion is established is called premise. Thus, an argument has two essential parts, a premise and a conclusion. An argument is a valid argument when if we accept the premise, we must necessarily accept the conclusion. Say in this case, the premise or premises are oranges are green. That is one premise. All green things make me sick. That is another premise. And based on these two premises, it is concluded that oranges make me sick. Right. If we accept that oranges are green, and if we accept that all green things make me sick, then oranges do necessarily make me sick. Thus, this argument can be said to be a valid argument because if we accept the premises, we must accept the conclusion. But this argument is not a sound argument because the first premise is not an acceptable premise. Oranges are not green. So, a sound argument is which is valid and where premises are acceptable. Say if we take this example, every animal needs to breathe in order to live. Fish are animals. Fish cannot breathe in the air, therefore fish cannot live in the air. Thus here, all the three premises, that is every animal needs to breathe, fish are animals, and fish cannot breathe in the air. All three premises are acceptable, and acceptance of these three premises necessarily leads to the conclusion that fish cannot live in the air. We'll see another argument. Indians are better entrepreneurs than Chinese. Therefore, India's economic prospects are brighter than China's. So friends, in this argument, India's economic prospects are brighter than China's is the claim that is made. And this claim is based on the given fact that Indians are better entrepreneurs than Chinese. So we have a conclusion and we have a premise. But then if we accept this premise, does it necessarily lead to the conclusion? Well, it does not. There is a gap between premise and conclusion here, and this gap is called assumption. So if we write the conclusion as India's economic prospects are brighter than China's, and premise as Indians are better entrepreneurs than Chinese, we can clearly see that this conclusion does not directly follow from the premise. We must identify the assumption that is made by the author here. If we analyze this argument, the two objects which are compared are Indians and Chinese in premise and India's and China's in conclusion. So word to word, there isn't any gap. Premise makes a case in comparative degree. Conclusion too makes the case in comparative degree. Once again, there is no gap. But if we see here, the premise talks about the entrepreneurship, whereas the conclusion talks about economic prospects. So unless we link entrepreneurship with economic prospects, the argument does not become valid. That gap between the premise and conclusion becomes our assumption that entrepreneurship leads to economic development. But then friends, the arguments that you find in examinations aren't so simple. We take another case. Last year in India, women who ran for state and national offices were about as likely to win as men. However, only about 15% of the candidates for these offices were women. Therefore, the reason there are so few women who win elections for these offices is not that women have difficulty winning elections, but that so few women want to run. So friends, in this question, to identify the conclusion, we can focus on this statement, which says, therefore the reason there are so few women who win elections for these offices is not that women have difficulty winning elections, but that so few women want to run. But why this statement and not the first one? Not just because it comes at the end of the paragraph, but information given prior to this sentence is more factual in nature and there is no inference made there. Women who ran for state and national offices were about as likely to win as men, and only about 15% of the candidates for these offices were women. So these statements give us the information, and this statement must give us the conclusion. Now this particular statement passes a judgment that so few women want to run. So that is the conclusion of the argument, that few women want to run for the state and national offices. And this particular claim is based on the fact that even though women were as likely to win as men, only about 15% of the candidates were women, right? And from this information, the author concludes that few women want to run for state and national offices. Now friends, we'll see the types of arguments. Logical arguments. Arguments where premise gives you information in percentage or proportionate terms and the conclusion is made in absolute values. The argument that generalizes an example given, or the argument that generalizes experimental studies or results of the experimental studies. In some cases, you have direct cause-effect relationship between the premise and the conclusion. And some of the arguments are based on deductive reasoning. We'll see each one of these in detail. If we see the logical arguments, where there is a logical gap between premise and conclusion, the one that we saw in case of entrepreneurship argument. Now these are the arguments that aim to logically derive conclusion from the premise, does not rely on quantitative values. So in this type of arguments, it is relatively easier to identify the assumption, but what makes it difficult for the examinee is the elaborate detail that appears in the passages. Arguments where premise gives you information in percentage or proportion terms and conclusion is made in absolute values. If we see an example, there is higher percentage of Indian graduate students going to the USA for masters than the percentage of Chinese students. Thus, it can be concluded that there are more Indian students doing masters from American universities than the Chinese students. Now friends, in this argument if we see, the information is given in terms of percentage of Indian graduate students and that of Chinese students. So higher percentage of this, does it necessarily mean greater number than this? We cannot say that, right? Unless we assume that the total number of Indian graduate students and Chinese students is same. In that case, of course, we can say that higher percentage of this would definitely mean a greater number or a higher number than the Chinese students. So the assumption here becomes total number of graduate students in India is same as that in China. You may also find arguments where an example is generalized, where the premise relies on information related to a set, whereas a conclusion is made for a superset. Thus the assumption in such cases becomes trends for the parameter for the example chosen and for the population are similar. Say if we take an example, in all the American universities put together, there are more Indian students pursuing masters in engineering subjects than there are Chinese students. Thus it can be said that American universities earn more in international tuition fees from Indian students than from Chinese students. Now friends, here if we see, the premise talks about masters in engineering students alone, whereas the conclusion is made out for all the students. Now, an information which may be true for a set may not necessarily be true for the superset. Thus, we can say that assumption here becomes trends for the parameter, that is number of students here, for the example chosen, that is for engineering subjects, and for the population, that is for all the students are same. At times, arguments rely on the results of certain experimental studies or surveys, and once again the conclusions are largely generalized in nature. Say if we take an example, studies show that people become more concerned with their public image as they grow older. Therefore, Mosaic Image Maker Institute should not target teenagers to promote their services. Now, studies. This focuses on one particular study or a few studies, which cannot be generalized for any agency operating anywhere in the world and catering to any age group in the market segment. Direct cause-effect relationship. The words like only if or only because would identify them. Say if we take an example, John succeeded at GMAT only because he trained with MyOrangeSlate. Now this is the phrase that identifies this. There is a direct cause-effect relationship. The cause is his training with MyOrangeSlate and effect is his success at GMAT. So in such cases, the assumption becomes restatement of the argument. John would not have succeeded at GMAT had he not trained with MyOrangeSlate. You may also find certain arguments on deductive reasoning format. In case of deductive reasoning, the arguments normally follow the rules of grammar and not so much the generally understood meanings of the words. Say once again, if we take an example, if Jane takes GMAT, she would go for MBA. If Jane does not go for MBA, she would take GRE. If Jane takes GRE, she would not get married. Now friends, if we see, in case of this argument, if Jane takes GMAT, she would go for MBA. The only thing we can say is, if she does not go for MBA, she would not take GMAT. That means we can reverse the proposition, that this statement, by taking negative of the sentence. That if she does not go for MBA, she would not take GMAT. Similarly, in this sentence, what we get is, if she does not take GRE, she would go for MBA. If she goes for MBA, we cannot say anything whether she would take GRE or not. But if she does not take GRE, she would definitely go for MBA. Similarly, if she takes GRE, she would not get married. So if she does not take GRE, we cannot say whether she would get married or not. But if she gets married, she would definitely not take GRE. Therefore, if Jane gets married, thus if she gets married, she would not take GRE. If she does not take GRE, she would go for MBA. But if she goes for MBA, we cannot say whether she would take GMAT or not. Thus, based on this argument, what we can say is, if Jane gets married, she would not take GRE, but she would go for MBA. The general approach to solving critical reasoning questions is what we'll see now. In case of CR questions, we must always first read the question. While in reading comprehension, it is advisable that we read passage first and then go to the questions. In critical reasoning, since there is only one question based on the paragraph, and the questions actually determine the extent of analysis required for the passages, we should first read the question and decide on the extent and type of analysis required. The next step would be to read passage critically. Critically, that is, without assuming anything or confusing with your understanding of subject matter, howsoever good it may be.